and the entire summer. So I'll come to that later. But I mean, there's three major points that I want to make. First one is linked to what Shahzad already outlined in terms of the colonial and the post-colonial sort of an idea of nation building in Pakistan. And I think in the second part, I would like to talk a bit more on how Imran Khan's rise and the results of these elections both reflect as well as represent the changing contours of Pakistani society, particularly over the last few decades. And my final part would have to do with the structural shifts that are taking place within Pakistani politics and the elites. So very quickly, I know the time is limited. So, I mean, as we all, most of you are familiar, so no need to go back into history. But creating a nation has always been a question in Pakistan, and is still a discussion which is very common and reflects in both the political, in the popular, in the academic discourses. I mean, who is a Pakistani? What is a Pakistani nation? And there have been multiple attempts to define that. So everything Indian is not Pakistani, or everything Pakistani is not Indian. That was a starting point by the Pakistani state in the early 50s. If you look at all the literature and the way Pakistan was imagined and shaped as a nation state. And religion, particularly religious affiliations, then were considered as the cement or the key instrument of nation building. And that particular emphasis on Islamic nationalism sort of has been a constant in Pakistan's history, and perhaps it got really accentuated after the civil war and breakup of Bangladesh, of Pakistan and creation of Bangladesh in 1971, when evidently religion could not play the part or the role that Pakistani leaders and the state had imagined that it would. And so after 1971, there was again this question as to how do we navigate this truncated state which comprises today's Pakistan, which was the West Pakistani territories and regions. And that particular question sort of is still a challenge for Pakistan's elites, as well as various communities within Pakistan, as to how far they adhere to the Islamic nationalist project that is considered as the sort of given destiny of Pakistan. And so from 1970s, we see this return to the earlier debates with even a greater emphasis. And it seems that that was the particular easy way out, because even though Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who was the Prime Minister of Pakistan from 1973 to 77, was a secularist, democrat, etc., but he put into place an Islamization program, and the first key marker in that project was the declaration of the Ahmadiyya community as non-Muslim through a parliamentary and a constitutional amendment in 1974. And since then, I think it was that whole particular inability of the elites to come up with a vision or a direction for Pakistan that they reverted time and again to the idea of an Islamic project. And Bhutto's government fell through a coup d'etat in 1977, and General Ziaul Haq, who took over as Pakistan's chief marshal administrator and later president, carried on and in fact advanced and expanded Bhutto's agenda further of actually creating a hybrid theocratic state. And some key instruments in that had to deal with constitutional and legal amendments, but most importantly, education, quote-unquote, reform in across disciplines, across various curricula, and in which a certain Pakistani identity and nationhood were fostered. So, I think the earlier speaker mentioned how even questioning or revisiting the idea of partition is treason, and it is actually now a part of the penal code where you cannot really question the partition of India and creation of Pakistan, and if you do, you can be fined or given a minor penalty of a jail term. So these amendments to the Pakistani Penal Code were also done under General Ziaul-Haq. But the net effect of that whole decade from 1977 to 1988 was a refashioning of not just the state structures, but also a massive social engineering project, which was kind of all-encompassing. So from setting up, prayer or salat committees in all government departments, to ensuring that the women in public spaces were to be dressed in a particular way, and the Pakistani state-controlled media, how did it project women and other communities. So there were very clear guidelines passed on to that. And since then, an entire generation has grown up in Pakistan, which considers this particular ideal or elusive sort of pursuit of what is an Islamic state or what is an Islamic Muslim country, and how does it play out, and how does it interact with daily life. And that particular change or shift kind of explains the rise of Imran Khan, other than all the eloquent histories that were presented by Shahzad, because Imran Khan, when from his earlier playboy, westernized Oxford Aitchison image, then undertook a very carefully constructed public project to present himself as a sort of a heralder of decolonization, where he gave up Western clothes and started wearing shalwar kameez. He started writing op-eds about how not to be a brown sahib and how to reject the symbols of Raj and the colonial experience. So there are all these writings, and his autobiography says a lot along these lines and goes into much detail. So his love for Iqbal, for example, which is again a very partial and selective reading of the poet and philosopher, also testifies to this particular ideal that Imran Khan kind of ascribes to and projects to a already large number of people educated and indoctrinated and schooled through a generation of social engineering project by the state. So therefore, there's a kind of a meeting of the minds that takes place since the 1990s, and that partly explains why his popularity, particularly in the educated urban middle classes, is so high and so formidable. And this particular drive for an Islamic nationalist project is further complicated by the kind of recent, and by recent I mean, let's say, the last 2 to 3 decades in particular, since the early 1990s, when Pakistan basically has undergone 3 major shifts. One is the sort of rapid urbanization. So in South Asia, at least, Pakistan is the fastest urbanizing country. Officially, the population, according to the colonial definitions of what is urban and what is rural, is still around 40%. But the people who live in urban conditions, quote unquote, the number may be close to 70%, which is to say, in small towns, in villages that are overpopulated, particularly in the Punjab and in some areas of Sindh, and with the rise of private education, private schools, private universities that caters, which cater to that particular demand of an urban population. The second shift, of course, is the demographic shift that Pakistan is currently experiencing, where the almost 2/3 of its population is below the age of 30. And the median age of Pakistani today is between 23 to 24, 23 and a half to be precise. And the third key shift is the expansion, actually a dramatic expansion of the middle classes. And that particularly, of course, that part of that is linked with the with globalization or the rise of service sector. And the service sector now comprises the largest component of Pakistan's GDP. I think more than 60% of the total GDP of Pakistan is in the services sector. I think maybe it's even more than 60%, 67% or so. And so these three particular shifts then are creating or leading to the creation of a new kind of a society, which is both in transition, which is both unsure of what kind of a direction the country is taking, and therefore both the Pakistani state as well as the political parties have been struggling to meet or respond to this shifting and changing dynamics in the last 2 decades especially. And that is one of the major reasons why we've had this third democratic transition in a decade, which is in Pakistan's short history a very first moment, because no other decade in Pakistan's history matches this transfer of civilian power, one civilian government handing over power to another one. Because after Bhutto's government in the 70s, we had a martial law, and after Ziaul Haq, we had a series of weak governments which were basically never completed their terms, and the civilian governments were pretty much controlled by the military and the civilian bureaucracy. And it is only in the last 1 decade or so, 11 years, that a third democratic transition has taken place. So that by itself shows that even the military considers launching a direct coup no longer a possibility in a very urbanized country where there is more and more demand of middle classes, of both services and rights from the state. And in that particular context, Imran Khan's rise kind of makes sense, because it is not totally de-linked from what is happening in the region and other parts of the world. So in neighboring India, where Modi's ascension to power is also viewed as a kind of a shortcut to economic success and meeting the aspirations of the emerging or the near middle classes, where he particularly promises a certain prosperous, corruption-free government and economic policies which totally neoliberal in scope and in nature do capture the imagination of these large segments of the population. I think it is not all too dissimilar from Turkey's experience, where Erdogan's promise of a prosperous and economically viable Turkey laced with some kind of an Islamic sort of nationalist character. In fact, Erdogan's ambition is transnational and global in at least rhetoric. And so therefore, and then, so I'm just citing and what has happened recently in Brazil, where a fascist party or a fascist leader has also been elected into office with the overt support of the military, and on the anti-corruption slogan, again responds to those demands of a clean government, of better functioning services, more jobs, etc., etc. And in this particular context, Imran Khan has been promising a corruption-free Pakistan. That has been his key slogan since the time he formed his party in 1993, I think. and this rhetoric became even more intense in the last 1 decade. When he was a kind of a minor opposition figure, chiding all the mainstream parties for their corrupt practices, for the way they had run Pakistan in a particular fashion, and not delivered either justice or services and an economically prosperous future. And in 2011 was the turning point when he actually demonstrated his major street power through a big rally in Lahore, and that was the turning point where he did emerge as a major stakeholder or a political player in the electoral arena. He lost the 2013 elections, unfortunately, but did emerge as the second largest political party in terms of the total votes that he garnered. But in 2018, he had the full support of both Pakistan's civil military bureaucracy, who wanted to basically get rid of the former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, who had fallen out with the military. And remember, Imran Khan also represents, there's a continuity in his rise as well, because the three major leaders, popular leaders in Pakistan, have been proteges of the military. So Ifghani Bhutto himself since the late 1950s and then 1960s, he served under General Ayub Khan, before that Sikandar Mirza, and then later he colluded with General Yahya Khan even when there was a genocide going on in East Pakistan and now Bangladesh. And when he fell out and became too big for his boots, he was cut to size and sort of shown the door by the military. Nawaz Sharif follows a almost identical pattern from mid 1980s, where he's propped up as a viable alternative to the Pakistan People's Party when Bhutto was dead. His daughter is the leader, and which is a threat, a populist threat to the old order. And Nawaz Sharif rises, but within a decade, Nawaz Sharif also kind of finds his own political vision. In particular, he differs with the military establishment on the policy of engaging with India and many other matters. And he is also ousted in a coup d'etat. He's not killed, unlike Bhutto, but he stays in exile, returns, and again wins an election. And by this election, Nawaz Sharif again demonstrated, despite the fact his party lost, it was the second largest party and extremely strong in parts of the Punjab province, which is again this urbanized and prosperous part of the Punjab province. Just to give you a context, is perhaps the 10th or the 9th largest country in population terms. It's 110 million people. And so the entire contest this in 2018 was about the Punjab. Who secures the Punjab province, whether it's Imran Khan or Nawaz Sharif. And both of them have something to offer for this new changing Pakistan. So in that particular context, because this time the establishment could not really take a risk of getting Nawaz Sharif back for the third time as Prime Minister, so they were extremely anxious and to ensure that he does not return to power, and therefore a series of steps were taken in the last 2 years to ensure that, first of all, Nawaz Sharif was out of the political arena, he was disqualified, then jailed right before the election, along with his daughter, who's emerged as a successor. And then there were sort of other reports of his party candidates being asked to leave Nawaz Sharif's party and join Imran Khan. And all of this was happening in a climate where media controls were directly put into place. And that also kind of affected and influenced the outcome of the election, because a lot of Pakistanis did not really know the extent of manipulation and engineering that was going on. But having said all of that, it is certain that at least in the urban parts of the country, Imran Khan enjoys a lot of support, and his populist rhetoric against corruption is very attractive for a large segment of the society. But the real question, as was earlier highlighted, is that is it leading Pakistan towards a kind of neo-authoritarian or neo-fascist moment? I mean, I think that remains to be seen because Imran Khan, whereas he is in power, there's a big question mark how much power he wields, because being propped up by the military, he would remain second in command at best. So it is ultimately, at least in the short term, it is Pakistan's military which is going to exercise a lot of power. But with the rise of Nawaz Sharif and his formidable support, there is a challenge to the military in the years to come. And so a lot of this struggle that is taking place within Pakistani society is indicative of the fact that we cannot be very certain and definitive about the shape of politics. It is something which is just sort of transitioning. Thank you.